My name is Fernando. With all due acknowledgements to this country and its indigenous peoples, I am presenting on the Treaty of Waitangi between New Zealand's indigenous populations and the European settlers. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 by over 500 Maori chiefs and British Crown representatives, is often referred to as New Zealand's founding document. Characteristic of treaties are exchange of promises. The fulfillment of such promises tends to be one-sided. This is the case with the Moorish and the British, as it is between other colonized indigenous populations elsewhere. Such promises become the basis of acquiring land or subjugating the indigenous populations and usurping their basic human rights and needs. The Treaty of Waitangi contained the terms and conditions upon which New Zealand would become a British colony. There are complex reasons why international, intercultural and even intertribal relationships do not function well and tend to fail. Differences in language and communication and therefore interpretations and translations, are at the roots. The treaty was hastily and inexpertly prepared by the British, as illustrated by these cartoon images. Judging by its outcome, one can only imagine what went on in the hearts and minds of the signatories. These cartoon images use humor effectively to explore some of the issues, events, and points of view relating to the treaty. The New Zealand Herald published an article by Non-Equality Before the Law Stands Before Race in 2004. The idea of indigenous Moorish and non-indigenous Pecos or settler citizens being one people, meant equality under Crown law, on the Queen's political sovereignty. Race has become almost a non-matter in the subject of equality, because over 150 years have long passed. People have come and gone, migrated to the cities or elsewhere and intermarried with settlers and others of foreign descent. It is easy to imagine that there might be few, racially pure Maori, left in New Zealand, or racially pure Aboriginals in Australia. For that matter, is anybody racially pure anywhere in the world? According to Dutton, some 70% of 24 to 37-year-olds who call themselves Maori are married to non-Maori. The cartoons above portray the state of affairs between the Moors and Pecos. The issues and grievances on both sides have condensed into issues and grievances of the privileged golfing character above, who states, "Oh boy, I've got a grievance all right. The despicable way my Maori ancestors were diddled and hoodwinked by my Pekee ancestors." There is an ironic and blatant disconnect in the interpretations and translations of the Waitangi Treaty. Its content and intent were very obviously affected by the understanding and choice of words between the contracting parties. For this reason, the legitimacy of the treaty was called into question. It caused many wars between the indigenous tribes who signed and those who did not. It caused strife between indigenous landowners and speculative property investors capitalizing on amassing vast lands. The Waitangi Tribunal, a formal and ongoing office of inquiry and investigations, was created in 1975 by the government for sorting out such conflicts. In 2014, the tribunal affirmed that Maori never ceded sovereignty to the Crown. This was on the back of the 1987 landmark Court of Appeal case between Maori Council versus Attorney General. It established that the Crown must honor the principles encapsulated in the Waitangi Treaty. Key in these was the principle of partnership because it was signed between two partners, the Crown and the Maoris. Another key point is the duty of care and active protection of the interests of the weaker indigenous parties, owed to them by the more powerful Crown parties. Only the New Zealand Parliament can change and pass the law, and the law should provide justice and equal protection for all. The Waitangi Tribunal initially heard only cases from 1975, but new law has been passed to allow claims caused by actions all the way back to 1840. Australia is lagging behind in developments of true reconciliation and material restitution, in support of tokenistic efforts of sorry and acknowledgements. The world is now inhabited by many cultural, ethnic, and racial societies. We all borrow and appropriate each other's values, cuisine and lifestyles in this globalized world. It would seem that race is not and should not be the issue in any discussion of fairness, justice and equality. It is the principles and the rule of law, not race, that should drive discussions of reconciliation and reform. As it is in New Zealand, it seems to be the way forward. The three universal principles in treaty making are partnership, protection and participation, with all its relevant and necessary elements. Sharing and consulting in decision-making equalize power on both sides. Lastly, to achieve equality, access to opportunities, societal benefits and public goods must be equalized and equality of outcome must be ensured. Here I try to grasp the stages that New Zealand went through to get where they are now as a point of reference for Australia and the world. I believe the world is watching New Zealand in this area. There is a mounting upsurge, not just in Australia, but in many parts of the world. More and more movements are reaffirming and reasserting human and civil rights among indigenous citizens. Governments and settler societies think that granting equal rights of citizenship to indigenous peoples is enough of a response to indigenous demands for justice. In the history of New Zealand, and even Australia, the symbolic recognition of the Maori and Aboriginals has been made without addressing what scholars like Humpage, in her article of 2008, describe as fundamental conflation of nation and state, or the fusion and amalgamation of identities, of two or more individuals, concepts, or places, sharing some characteristics of one another. Like Australian Aborigines, the Moris are not homogeneous as there are the Wainau, Hipu and Iwi cohorts. Yet the state nation-building agendas, behind citizenship and treaty-making, sit in tension with indigenous nationalisms. This reflects an alternative form of nation-building not framed by the state, which is the self-determination and self-governance they desire. Humpage first identifies 4 major citizenship regimes, then explores possible directions for revisioning New Zealand's citizenship and treaty to overcome historical limitations. This is the same conundrum experienced by our Maori cartoon character from Pākehā ancestry in a previous slide. I cannot situate Australia's position in these structural regimes. There are positive and negative issues on both sides of government and indigenous society. A multitude of complex reasons, all due simply to irreconcilable differences, values and preferences, determine to what extent balancing the issues on both sides become important in decision-making. While debates and controversies remain unresolved, the question we might ask must be, yes, okay, so what is there to do now and how do we go about it? New Zealand can be a new point of reference and others can follow its path. How can Australia keep abreast of developments in the area of human rights, justice and equality? How do we separate the people from the land? How do we communicate with a community who may not conceive of resource management, for example? If they do not speak our modern language and we do not speak theirs, like in the making of Waitangi Treaty? How do we tell them that their history and culture may not be as important as a road, a dam or a mine? That even sacred sites have dollar values? What decisions should resource and business management people make and how will it affect indigenous peoples and the environment long term? In all of history, it seems big changes has been and will always be brought about by war and conflicts. The mechanisms of war is even touted as the great equalizer by political historians. Always at the roots of war and conflicts are 4 interrelated aspects that feed into each other, for better or for worse. Social, political, economic and cultural. Societal collapse, due to mounting issues of fear, insecurity, deepening poverty concerns, arising out of discrimination and exclusion, become political issues of power control, framed by abuse, exploitation and corruption. These all have effects in the economic realm, which I define here as the affluence of the more fortunate 10% as opposed to the extreme suffering and deprivation of the global 90% poor. This is embodied in the common sentiment: the rich gets richer and the poor gets poorer. Will this ever change? There are undeniable global threats to indigenous people, increasingly exacerbated by environmental damage and climate changes. They continue to suffer state discrimination and eviction to exploit their assets. Their land is stripped of its natural resources and left contaminated afterwards. Their intellectual or cultural properties are continually misappropriated. They do not have easy access to medical and health care, nor to legal help. They are excluded from political participation and from necessary funding by the state. All these, a seemingly permanent cycle of disadvantage for centuries. I'm sorry is nice, but won't change things. More than lip service is required. Symbolic gestures are appreciated, but I think more material, sustainable reforms are required. A treaty can provide the platform to establish new paradigms of reforms to address all aspects of the social, cultural, political and economic areas that must be tackled. As a whole, a treaty can deliver opportunities for mutual gains. It can establish bicultural, even multicultural approach to education. This would be real recognition. A treaty can enable and empower the indigenous peoples to become the agents for change the world needs, as the International Labour Organization defined them. Their figures state there are approximately 370 million indigenous people in 5,000 different groups in 90 countries worldwide, 70% of whom live in Asia. ILO states, indigenous territories constitute 20% of the Earth's landmass. But this landmass harbors 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. This says a lot to me about the capacity and ingenuity of indigenous people for guardianship and management of their environment. It highlights the urgency of treaty-making between these guardians and the rapacious character of liberal government. With indiscriminate and unlimited economic growth and development, things must change now. For all. It's time to ensure events of the past do not play out in exactly the same ways any further. It's time. Thank you.